In the history of the 20th century world, one of the defining milestones happens to be the Great Depression of the 1930s. When the Wall Street crashed on 23rd October 1929, it was not simply a falling of the New York Stock Exchange. It ultimately ended up unleashing a financial crisis which then blew up beyond all proportions and turned into an economic crisis of global dimensions. The Great Depression of 1929 is considered to be the archetypal phenomenon by way of depression because it highlighted, as the communist critiques were later to say, one of the glaring problems of global capitalism. What is more important, however, is not simply the crisis of capitalism it projected, but also the fact that it marked the end of two of the most defining features of 19th century economic liberalism. On the one hand, the principles of free trade began to gradually give way to protectionist economies, and then beyond that, in terms of trade agreements, it was no longer to be the world of free trade that Adam Smith had envisaged and the Industrial Revolution gave Europe the boldness to pursue. On the other hand was also the fact that the gold had for long been the principal standard against which currencies' values would be pegged. In 1929, the gold standard also came to a close. The Great Depression of the 1930s was effectively a chain reaction generated by a crisis that was purely domestic to the US economy. What happened was that at the end of the Great War, the United States had emerged as the world's largest economic power. It was as much the world's largest industrial powerhouse as also one of the world's largest agricultural exporters. And when the war came to a close and the demand generated by the war began to subside, US agricultural production was not curtailed proportionately. So as more and more agricultural products were available in the market, food prices began to slump in the early 1920s. With falling food prices, it measured up into an increase in the real income of the US industrial sector, in fact, across the economic sectors. And with the increased amount of money available, increased disposable income, the US consumer began to enter the market and generated something like a consumer boom. One of the most signal features of this consumer boom was the emergence of the internal combustion engine and the Ford Model T car. This was also, however, the period when a large number of American households began to aspire towards the possession of a transistor radio and a refrigerator and even some other heavy consumer durables which were not easily to be purchased. But given the rise in real income, these could be had, and this led to a consumer durables boom. There was additionally the point that consumer durables, when they have to be marketed, they would frequently have to come with loans. So easy credit, consumer credit began to grow, and this was also a period when a growing number of American households were aspiring to having a house of their own. So this led to a real estate boom as well. By the late 1920s, the situation, however, began to grow out of hand, because as agricultural prices kept on going down, the people who had borrowed, the agriculturists who had borrowed in order to invest in either agricultural production or for the purchase of consumer durables, began to find it increasingly difficult to service their debts. And this increasing inability of US agriculturists to service their debt began to lead to a credit squeeze. By 1928-29, this also began to have its corresponding phenomena in the industrial sector, as this easily available house loans meant Loans were going to be given to people who could not service their debts in the long run. And by 1928-29, this credit bubble that had emerged suddenly burst. In 1929, this began to take the shape of banks falling like nine pins. It is estimated that at one stage, almost 1 in every 3 US banks were falling because of this consumer credit problem. Small banks began to be swallowed up by bigger banks as they were going out of business. There was a major panic reaction because banks which had lent heavily in European industrial recovery in the mid-1920s under the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, they suddenly decided to pull out gradually from the European market and bring in that kind of capital and reinvest in the American market, so that somehow the banks would stop falling all over the place. So American capital, which was pivotal to the economic recovery and reconstruction of Europe in the 1925-29 period, suddenly began to reverse the capital flow. The reason was that the investment made by the American private and public sector units in the European banks, primarily in the financial sector, came in two forms. On the one hand, the capital that was invested by the Americans was simply left in the European central banks to sort of give up the feeling of security deposit growing up, so that the bank would be able to lend for industrial recovery. Two, in cases where the American bankers chose to go for direct investment in industrial ventures, these were invested in long term. So once in the 1920s the American capital began to be pulled out, European finances were in dire straits. The principle on which American money was given, however, made the crisis even greater. American investment in the 1920s began when it was becoming increasingly clear that the war debts that the European nations had contracted from America would not be serviced unless Germany was making good its reparations commitments to the European powers, especially France. So the Dawes Plan of 1925 and the Young Plan, which was to come in 1929, made it absolutely certain that German reparations would never stop, and this was done by American investment in the German economy. So America invested in Germany, Germany repaid the compensation to France, then France would repay their debts, and France would repay it either to Britain or to America. If Britain was repaid, then Britain would be able to repay America's debts. So it was all coming in a cyclical manner. Once the Americans were pulling out of the banks, the German banks began to be hit the largest. The Kreditanstalt of Austria and the Darmstädter National Bank of Germany, they collapsed in 1931 once this money was being pulled out, because virtually their entire capital reserve had fled. Now this would have been acceptable had the repercussions been limited right there. This, however, sadly was not the case, because once American money was pulled out, both of the central banks and of projects with long gestation period, local European capitalists, panic-stricken by the departure of American capital, also began to pull out their capital from the capital market. And this meant that the entire bullion reserve that was required to keep a bank functioning was suddenly beginning to depart. There was a run on European banks. Kreditanstalt in Vienna, Darmstädter National in Germany were not the only two banks to have collapsed, they were the biggest banks to have collapsed. A string of other bank failures began to set in. At this stage, the crisis remained financial, but the fallout, the economic fallout of this was no less considerable, because once banks were faced with the prospect of falling all over the place, the first thing they started to do was tighten the credit to the industrial sector. So on the one hand, there is a surplus, there was a demand, there was a production surplus in terms of the market, Also, a credit crunch setting in. For the entrepreneurs, the inevitable option was simply to curtail production and throw people out of jobs by retrenching them, and also generate less employment. So what begins as a financial crisis then begins to blow up into a larger economic crisis. Fallout of this Great Depression happened, as I said, in two principal directions. First was that a number of currencies were unable to stem the flight, the outward flight of capital from their central banks. So gradually currencies had to be taken out of the gold standard. In early 1931, there was a conference that was held at Lausanne. In that conference, Germany's Chancellor Brüning had declared quite categorically that Germany was completely unwilling and unable to pay any further or fulfill any of its war debt commitments. This was to result in a still larger financial crisis. The crisis was to be stemmed by what was known as, or was attempted to be stemmed by what was known as the Hoover moratorium. President Hoover in 1931 had declared a moratorium which suggested that under no circumstances was any reparation or war debt to be paid over the next 1 year. It was hoped that by 1932 situation would improve. The Lausanne Conference, however, which was held at the end of the Hoover moratorium, when Brüning made it very clear that Germany was unable to continue to pay, and neither would Germany be able to pay as it was originally scheduled, an interest on the defaulted amount for the year, everyone knew for all practical purposes that the issue of war reparations and war debts was dead. But nevertheless, nobody would admit it very openly, because US presidential elections was around, and if any European government was to make it very certain, was to declare in fact that there was to be no reparations or no war debt payments anymore, then either the incumbent or the incoming American president would not be able to continue in any further dealings with the Europeans. The question was then, what happens to the currencies? Because for all practical purposes, once the war debt and the reparations crisis had been sort of shelved rather than solved, all the governments were faced with a major balance of payments crisis. Germany had paid for a year, and that made a huge amount of budget deficit. Same for France when it was clearing its war debts also. The general trend was around this point of time to go for a balanced budget and reduction of state expenditure. After a time, it became very clear that in order to balance the budget and reduce expenditure, it was also very necessary to allow the currency to devalue, to depreciate in value. The problem was all the currencies were pegged against gold. So in 1931, after the British government was faced with a major financial crisis and the Labour government, which was then in power, had to resign and a national government came into being, within weeks it was decided that British government, the British currency, the pound sterling, would be taken off the gold standard. The aim was that the British economy, the British exports would become much more competitive. As the value of pounds fell, British goods would become cheaper in comparison with any other economies that it would be dealing with, and they decided to go ahead with that. Once that decision was taken, all other economic forces which had some major trading relations with Britain began to follow suit. New Zealand followed suit. All the British dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand followed suit. And even those powers which were not a part of the British Commonwealth, such as Argentina, followed suit, because their greatest commerce being with Britain, excessive devaluation of the pound sterling would simply take their industries out of business. The Americans continued with the gold standard, but they allowed in 1933 their economy, their currency to devalue rapidly. There were other governments that left the gold standard for all practical purposes without actually admitting to say so. By 1933, therefore, you could find three different blocks emerging. One, which had remained with the gold standard, such as the United States, such as France, but had devalued even inside, even by remaining within the gold block. There was a sterling block, which is basically those currencies that were choosing now to pegging their value against the sterling rather than gold, and which had left the gold standard along with Britain. There was a third block of countries, such as Germany, such as Italy, most of the Central European powers, Brazil, Egypt, which remained officially within the gold standard, but for all practical purposes had stopped altogether being there because they imposed exchange controls. The second strategy that nations frequently adopted was in response to the economic crisis generated by the original financial one. Because the financial crisis had impacted each and every economy by generating problems beginning with recession, then finally sliding into depression. Now the challenge before each of the European and American economies was to generate more employment. Now this could be done only if there was guarantee that the domestic industrial production would somehow survive. The Europeans understood this problem earliest, and they also tried to make the soonest attempts at stemming this crisis. In the 1930s, just as the depression was beginning to set in, the Germans and the Austrians came together with the proposal of a customs union. Now for the French, this sounded too much like the forbidden Anschluss, which is union between Germany and Austria, which was forbidden by the Versailles Treaty. So the Germans and the Viennese, who wanted a customs union to create a large German market which would be able to hide behind protective tariffs, was scuttled by the French. There was also another proposal that the German-Austrian customs union would be joined by the Danubian states, which is the reason why Czechoslovakia, facing that it would ultimately be sucked into the orbit of Berlin, was unwilling to let this thing go through, and Prague therefore supported Paris in scuttling the proposal of a German-Austrian union. And in this case, the first successful initiative probably came from the United States of America once again, with the passage of the Hollis-Moots Tariff Act. Under the Hollis-Moots Tariff Act, the US President could increase tariff barriers to as high as 60% in order to provide safeguards for US industry. By 1933, almost each and every one of the European powers had thrown up high tariff barriers to prevent entry from any foreign competitor. The most ironical development, of course, was with the introduction of high protective tariffs by the British government in 1932. After being a strong proponent of the principle of free trade from the days of Adam Smith in 1776, for the first time in 140 years, British economy was given the benefit of tariff protection. By 1933, therefore, just as there was a threefold division in terms of convertibility of currency, whether a currency was pegged against the gold or against exchange control but still gold, or whether it was pegged against merely the sterling block. Similarly, in the realm of international commerce also, there was almost a threefold division. On the one hand, there was the British Commonwealth, an economy, a large chunk of the world, which was dedicated entirely or revolving entirely around the British economy, the British Empire. The British Empire included Britain, its dominions such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and also its dependent colonies such as India, such as Kenya, Uganda, which is basically the Commonwealth nations, as also those economies of the world which were not members of the British Empire, not members of the British Commonwealth, nevertheless which had Britain as its single largest trading partner, such as Scandinavia and such as Ireland, such as Argentina. Together, this made up one bloc, which came under the principle known as the Ottawa Principle of 1932. There was also another bloc which was pegged against gold and revolving around the British and the American and the French economy. So on the one hand, those economies that counted America as its greatest trading partner, such as China, such as Japan, were members of this bloc, as also the French, who were refusing to take the currency off the gold standard. There was a third division, of course, which was to be the most momentous of them all. Those economies which had nominally continued with the gold standard, but had exchanged tight economic controls and were regulating the economic activity almost completely. These were the corporate states of the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese. They were embarking on something like sort of exchange controls as also barter economy, so that there was no necessary requirement actually to transfer bullion in order to buy and sell. There was German coal would be shipped to Brazil in return for Brazilian cotton or Brazilian tobacco or Egyptian cotton. So barter economy dispensing with the need for currency convertibility altogether. The one last impact of the Great Depression that needs to be emphasized upon in conjunction with this period was the spurt it gave for the issue of disarmament. In the 1930s, the predominant economic orthodoxy had been that for an economic depression, the government's responsibility is to reduce its state expenditure and go for a balanced budget. And the most unproductive the unproductive expenditure for a government always tended to be in the realm of armaments. So disarmament, an issue which had been mooted in the Versailles Treaty of 1919 and then generally the Paris Peace Conference, which led to the creation of a disarmament conference, it had not really progressed very far. In 1930-31, it was reinvented, as it were, in order to reduce military expenditure across the European economies. It was decided that all the countries would limit themselves only to defensive expenditure. This, however, ultimately collapsed because Germany set the cat among the pigeons by asking which is an offensive instrument. And the Germans were the only people consistent in their definition that any weaponry that has been proscribed under the Versailles Treaty should be considered as an offensive weapon and it should be immediately dismantled. So the Germans under Hitler in 1933-1934 began moving in the direction of military rearmament, and that generated a degree of economic activity which helped Germany come out of the economic depression. To close the discussion on the economic depression, it was becoming very clear that the economic depression had disfigured the world that had come as a result of the Industrial Revolution. On the one hand, the cardinal principle of free trade, which maximized advantages for industrial powers in terms of their areas of strength, was being discontinued. Second, the idea of a global free trade around one single foreign exchange yardstick, which is gold, was also going to be discarded. This was a period of economic nationalism which had been anticipated by the Hawley-Smuts Act, and then it was followed up by all the countries by throwing up high tariff barriers. By the time Europe was coming out of the economic depression, they were no longer going back to the period of economic free trade. They were going into the direction of bilateral trading agreements. As a result, the United States by 1934-35 began to have bilateral trading agreements with all the individual European powers. Same was for Germany, same was for Britain. The volume of trade declined, the volume of global commerce at this period, because it was limited by the circumstances of bilateral trading agreements, they declined, but they served the very crucial function of keeping industrial sectors alive. It was this period of economic protectionism and the breakdown of the global economic order which was ultimately to propel Europe in the direction that was to lead to the Second World War. When the World War came to a close and a new economic order had to be brought into shape, the world returned, or was trying to return towards the direction of a global free trade by talking about multilateral trading agreements.